Super duper. So, hello and welcome. Another nerdy Zoom. Very exciting. They're rolling now, aren't they? Tonight's session is operant conditioning the quadrants. So I am genuine again. I'm thrilled to see so many people that I know and love already, and names that I do not know. It's quite exciting meeting new folk each time. So as before, I'm Rach. I'm the owner and founder of Focus Dog Training and Bob and Pals Dog Walking. I am a certified trainer with the Dog Training College, and I'm a pro dog trainer with Absolute Dogs and lots of other courses and what have you. I'm describing myself as a force-free, science-based trainer. And I absolutely love sharing all this stuff with you. It's really, really exciting for me. So thank you for joining me each week. Today, we are delving into the fascinating world of operant conditioning, looking at what those quadrants are that you'll often hear dog trainers talking about and referenced on the internet, but not always with the most understanding. And I'm hoping to really clarify that for you today. So this week we've had a slight change of plans. I do want this to be really interactive, but of course a lot of it is informative, isn't it? So this week what we're going to do is I'm going to give you my full presentation as per usual. As we are going through, please use the chat function as you think of questions to pop your chat function in there. I will do my utmost to not get distracted by the words appearing on my screen. Lauren is sitting here moderating this evening, so she's going to sit and watch those comments and those questions as they are coming up. She's going to collect them. And then at the end, Lauren's going to ask me the questions. So if you're perhaps not brave enough to ask on the camera, that's absolutely fine and more than reasonable. Ask the question away in the little chat function there, and Lauren will ask at the end, and we'll have a really nice conversation for you. If you at that point would like to jump in and clarify something because we've maybe misunderstood it, please do. But obviously we'll leave that to your discretion. So without further ado, let's get on. You'll notice me looking at this screen a lot more tonight. There's a lot that I'm going to get through with you. So you may well want a pad of paper and a pen if you have not already come prepared. So let's delve in. So operant conditioning, simply put, operant conditioning is where behaviours either strengthened or weakened depending on the consequence of that behaviour. Last week, we looked at classical conditioning, which was very much about associations of behaviours. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, it focuses a lot more on consequences. So a behaviour is performed, a consequence comes afterwards, and as a result of that consequence, the behaviour is either increased or decreased. We see more of it or we see less of it, okay? In truth, operant conditioning is an absolutely massive topic, and it's got loads of avenues to explore, and you can trip up and fall down all sorts of little rabbit holes. And I'm going to keep my focus today really strictly laser focused on the quadrants. Now, it's just because it allows me to get it through in this time. And I'll be honest with you, I think I'm still going to go over half an hour. If you need to leave, fair dues. It is a really enthralling topic, though. So if you want to read more, it's a really exciting place to kind of get yourself stuck in and start learning and reading a lot more around. And it's worth noting at this point, before I go any further on, that I'm going to be talking a lot about consequences. And in some species, because of course learning happens across species, it's not just humans, it's not just dogs that do learning, it's all species. Some species, humans particularly, have a very good understanding of delayed consequence, and we can work for a delayed consequence. Really good example, going to work. We get up and we go to work knowing that the consequence of that is that we're going to get paid at the end of the month. That's a delayed consequence, particularly now when it's the start of the month. We've just been paid. We've got a full month to wait before that then happens for us again. And we're quite comfortable working with that. Another example might be dieting, right? We'd start a diet now knowing that the consequence of that diet is that we'd not necessarily look better or feel better tomorrow, but in a couple of weeks or perhaps a couple of months, depending on what our feel better is ascribed as, right? But very quickly, even with those two examples that I've given you, it's quite clear to see that the concept of delayed gratification, delayed consequences can sometimes lead to less than ideal behavior change. For example, dieting, right? Lots of people started dieting, but not necessarily followed it through because of the delay. Now, for the sake of this presentation, I clearly am a lot focused on dogs. I'm really going to be focused on those. And they have a very limited understanding of delayed consequences. They don't really hold that quite so well as we do. So for here in this example and for the rest of this presentation, when I talk about consequences, what I mean is a consequence that is delivered incredibly quickly following a behaviour. seconds, literally seconds after a behavior has been performed, that consequence must be delivered for it to have a really clear connection that that behavior resulted in that consequence. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about throughout. Now, you know now that I love to give you the science behind all of this. And tonight is no different. I'm bringing with me a science experiment, but usually I like to give you the science experiment up front and then go into the dog stuff. Tonight, I'm going to weave it through for you because I think it'll make a little bit more sense. The experiment I'm going to talk to you about is B.F. Skinner's rats. So a lot of people have heard of Skinner's rats. And it's a really lovely way, you'll see why I pulled that face in a second, a really interesting way to really understand the concepts that we're looking at tonight. So B.F. Skinner, he thought classical conditioning was a bit too simplistic. This idea of associated learning was a bit too simplistic to describe all behaviour change. And he set about to prove this using some rats. And he created a little box for these rats. Now, this little box had in it quite a few things. And the bits that we need to know about for tonight was there was a chute in there to deliver food. So a little way for food pellets to be delivered through and into the box. There was a lever in there. And unfortunately, the floor was electrocuted. Not very nice, but there we go. You'll see why that's important in a bit. Now, with this box and these experiments, he found that there were 4 main ways to really influence the behaviour of those rats that were in his box. And those 4 ways became the 4 quadrants. So what I'm going to do is going to talk you through those 4 quadrants. I'm going to explain what Skinner did to prove those quadrants, and then I'm going to explain how they relate to us in our dog training and the choices that we might like to make when we're training our dogs. So the 4 quadrants then, there's positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. Now, operant conditioning is inherently a very scientific way of looking at learning. So in this case, punishment literally means something that reduces a behavior. And reinforcement literally means something that increases a behavior, okay? And positive and negative, positive means an addition, adding to, and negative means subtracting, taking away from. We're talking about it in a much more scientific definitions than the commonly accepted good or bad that comes from positive and negative, okay? So you just might need to keep reminding yourself that we're talking very, very scientifically here tonight, and it's not necessarily good or bad. It's adding and subtracting things, okay? So let's get into them. The first quadrant I'm going to tell you about is positive reinforcement, the one that most people know, quite like, and love. It's bandied around a lot. You often hear people say that they're a positive reinforcement trainer. I guess I would probably sit on that spectrum as well, although I would class myself as a force-free trainer, as you hear me say every week, right? So positive reinforcement, you might see it written down like this, R plus, positive reinforcement. That's for your notes, for handy notes there. And to demonstrate this, what Skinner did was he put some hungry rats in a box, or rather a hungry rat in a box. And naturally, by virtue of the fact that they're rats, they moved around. And as is prone to happen, they accidentally hit that lever. And when they accidentally hit that lever, a good thing happened. Food was released and came into the box, right? So the consequence of hitting the lever was that food was added in. Something good happened after a behavior was performed. The consequence of hitting the button was that good stuff was added. And the rats found this very reinforcing. They liked this, right? So what happened was they very quickly worked out that if they pushed that button more food came in, and they got very effective at it. So what happened is he'd put the rat in the box and it'd go straight to the lever, whack the lever and get the food. Happy days, right? They offered more hitting of the lever because they found the reward reinforcing. Excellent. Okay. Now for us, very easy to see over in dog training, especially if you've been training with us, because it's the absolute core of what we're doing, right? We ask our dog to sit, and as soon as they put their bottom on the floor, they get a treat. We add a positive reinforcement, a good consequence after they've performed the behavior. And in most cases, the dog goes, I liked that. So they do more of it. The next time we ask for a sit, they're more likely to do that behavior because they like the good consequence that comes after it. And the truth is, in dog training, and certainly with owning our pets and loving our dogs, if you want to see more of a behavior, If you add a positive reinforcement after that, you add a good consequence to that behavior. You say, I like that behavior, I want to see more of it. You add in a good consequence, you're going to see more of it, right? So very simple, really. I like that behavior, I want to see more of it. Add in a good consequence. Something good happens when you do that, kid, right? The bit that gets complicated here, though, and the reason that most dog trainers have a job is because as a dog owner, how do you get that first behavior in the first place, right? So let's say, for example, you would really like to reinforce, you would really like to pay your dog to give good consequences to your dog for walking next to you, right? You would really like it if your dog would, and you would be quite happy giving them good reinforcement for doing that and saying, I like this behavior, right? But what if the dog never offers that behavior in the first place, right? What if your dog is just never here? So you can't reward and you can't give good consequences to behavior that just doesn't exist, can you, right? And that's where we come in as trainers, right? So it's a really valid question as well. Like, how do I reinforce a behavior that just doesn't exist? And I'll be honest with you, that's beyond the scope of tonight's session, but that's exactly what we're looking at next week. We're looking at criteria in training, right? So I'll go through it all then. I just wanted to raise it as a really valid concern at this point. The really interesting thing for me, though, is the positive reinforcement, the stuff that we miss. And that's the stuff that we don't necessarily truly understand to start with until we get delving in, right? So, for example, right, in our chat a few weeks ago about dominance, before that chat happened, it might have been a held belief that your dog was on the sofa because it was exerting dominance, right? And that's a really common thing that we still hear now, right? That the dog is on the sofa because it wants to be the boss. But we know from our discussion before that that's probably not the case, right? And this is lovely because this is what operant conditioning explains for us. Operant conditioning tells us that the reason that the dog is on the sofa is because they like the consequence, right? The consequence of being on a sofa is that you're warm and you're comfy. And it's really nice. There's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that dogs actually like sleeping on raised platforms too, a little bit like cats, right? So it's hitting a lot of likes for our dogs. So because the consequence of being on the sofa is good, it's positively reinforced, then we know that that behavior is going to increase, right? They're going to go on the sofa more often, right? Very exciting. If you want your dog to lie on the floor because you would rather they did that, you then need to come up with a clever way to make sure that the floor has some positive consequences associated with it, right? Laying on the floor equals a positive association, that there is a positive consequence for laying on the floor there. And that's on you guys for training. So we love positive reinforcement. And not only because it literally results in an increase in behavior, I mean, that is the whole point of training, right? But also because it has lovely side benefits, right? The benefits, it creates a beautiful, positive learning environment. And positive learning environments help your learners feel safe and secure. And that's the truth, whether it's us that's in the learning environment or our dogs that are in the learning environment. If we can make our learner feel safe and secure, they are much more likely to be able to apply themselves to and enjoy the learning experience that's happening. Therefore, it's going to be far more effective as a training tool, right? And it's just such a lovely way to be able to really strengthen that bond between human and dog. I'll often give people the example of when I was training with Bob years ago now. I remember standing in a hall. I remember looking down at him and he was sat there, bless him, just looking up at me so beautifully. And I had this absolute heartstring moment. I genuinely felt my heart go, like out. And I just looked at him and I went, oh, I bloody love you. And there was just this moment of connection. And that truly came about because of this beautiful environment that we've managed to create, where everything that he did was getting this great consequence coming from it. And we were both riffing off each other. And it's just such a great vibe. So we're all massive fans of positive reinforcement. And I'm sure I didn't need to sell it to you guys because you already. So the second quadrant then that we're going to look at is literally the flip reverse of this, I guess. Positive punishment, which you might see written down as this. So P plus punishment plus adding punishment, right? And a punishment, positive punishment, means that the learner gets something bad as a consequence of behavior with a view to driving that behavior down, right? So that is a decrease in that behavior. Skinner and his rats. So he taught the rats to press the lever. Good stuff happened when you press the lever, right? And they were doing that. Spot on. And Skinner went, let's change the rules. So instead, you're not going to like it. I'm telling you now, you're not going to like it. I'm sorry. Next time they press the lever, the electric floor switched on. Not a pleasant experience, especially if you weren't expecting it, right? I suppose, actually, I don't know, I'd prefer to be electrocuted if I wasn't expecting it. I don't know, there's a whole discussion, right? Not a pleasant experience. Rat presses the lever, floor goes electric. Not nice. Rat presses the lever, floor goes electric. Well, guess what? The rats stopped pressing the lever. It was a punishing experience. It was horrible. The behaviour went down. We saw a decrease in offered behaviour, right? Now, dog training then. In my experience, a large proportion of the dog training advice that the general public hold and pass out to one another, you know, all these people, these friendly neighbours that we meet and the people that we bump into in the park, a lot of their training advice appears to sit quite firmly in this quadrant. And it leaves a lot of my clients kind of going, is that right? I'm not sure. And we have lots of discussions around this. So, a really obvious example, puppies. People still talk about rubbing puppies' noses in the pee or the poo when they've done it, right? Okay, that would be a positive punishment. You didn't like that. The consequence, hopefully, the human is thinking, would be that the dog is less likely to do that again, right? Another one would be a lead jerk or a lead tug, right? So here, and we see this one quite a lot in the street, don't we? As uncomfortable as it is, I regularly drive around and I often see this. I saw it literally this morning and it always turns my stomach a little bit because I find it very uncomfortable to watch. But essentially, human is walking down a street, they're getting dragged along by their dog, and after a while they think, I'm bloody sick of this. And they'll tug on that lead, right? And it's attached to the collar, so the dog gets that little jerk. And the concept here is that the dog performs a behavior, it reaches the end of its lead, and the consequence of that is an unpleasant one. You get hurt, essentially, there's discomfort applied. Therefore, they learn to not get to the end of the lead. They see a decrease in that behavior. Getting to the end of the lead is decreased, right? Now, there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, the very fact that you're sat here watching me right now means that you're likely shifting around in your seat, feeling a little bit uncomfortable at the concept. If you're anything like me, you feel a bit sick when you see it in real life, right? Because of the way we train, we tend to attract people who have similar, thoughts. And they don't particularly, in my experience, the people that we train with don't particularly like hurting their dog, right? So this particular quadrant doesn't fit most people's standards of ethical training. And certainly ethics is a thing that is discussed quite a lot amongst dog trainers. It's something that we're going to talk about later as well. Not today, but another day. The other thing is, in order for this technique to work and to be effective, the dog has to actually find it punishing. Okay? And the truth is, and it's a really uncomfortable truth, the truth is that most people don't hurt their dog enough for this to work. Now, that's horrible. That's a really horrible thing to say. I'll say it again. Most people don't hurt their dog enough for this to work. Okay. If this was to be effective, for your dog to consider it punishing, it actually have to punish it. It actually have to be bad enough that the dog goes, didn't like that, not going to do that again. Right. And the truth is that when you see it on the streets, the reality is that you see people and they'll do a couple, but then the dog might stop for a little bit, but then it'll soon go back to pulling again. And you'll see the same people doing the same behavior multiple times. And what that tells us very clearly, scientifically looking at it, that behavior has not decreased. Therefore, the punishment is not effective. It is not considered effective by the learner. The dog is telling you, I don't consider this a punishment. I'm not going to change my behavior. You might get it short term, but you're not getting it long term, right? And this demonstrates one of the failures of positive punishment. In the absence of the punishment, or if the punishment isn't deemed bad enough, the behavior often reappears, right? So you were constantly stuck in this cycle of having to consistently punish your dog, which is a very unpleasant experience to have, right? Unfortunately, it is also documented, and it's clearly documented, that positive punishment often leads to aggression in the learner, perhaps as a coping mechanism, and anxiety, which may start out being related to the thing that is punishing them, but then can generalize and become bigger into the world. And certainly that's something that we see in practice quite a lot. Something that might have been reasonably small can somehow grow, and it's quite a sad place to be. So it's not a particularly helpful training technique as well. And that's probably its own very strong argument for not using it, because positive punishment doesn't guide the learner in any way. It simply says, no, don't do that. It doesn't show them what you actually do want them to do. It's not constructive in any way. Positive reinforcement is very helpful because it shows our learners what we would like them to do. You putting your bottom on the floor is something that works for me. I like it when you do this behavior. Positive punishment simply says, no, not that. No, not that. And it leaves our learner kind of guessing and wondering what it is that they're meant to be doing. And that's not very helpful for learning new behaviors, right? So I think it's fair to say we don't choose to use that quadrant for training. We don't often recommend that it works for training, but it is often still used in training. Okay. So those two quadrants, reasonably simple to wrap your head around, right? You add a thing and it's either good or bad, and it either increases or decreases behavior, right? The next two quadrants can get a little bit more wibbly. Don't worry, we'll talk it through nice and steady. So removing stuff, then that's what happens in these ones. Negative reinforcement. So remember, negative is removal. Reinforcement is something that increases behavior. So in negative reinforcement, I'm removing something bad as a consequence of performing behavior, hoping to increase that behavior. Okay, so I'm going to say it again so you get your head around it. Negative reinforcement means removing something bad as a consequence of a behavior, therefore the behavior increases. Why does that work? Why does the behavior increase? Because the bad thing's gone away, right? I like the result of this behavior. The bad thing went away. You'll see it makes a lot of sense when I start giving you examples. So in Skinner's experiment, this looked like turning the electric floor on before adding the rat. So the electric floor was on, then the rat got added, so the experience was negative. And turning the lever made the electric floor switch off. So therefore, we saw an increase in turning of the lever because the rats knew it got rid of the bad thing. Okay, I'm hoping that's starting to make sense. Once the examples come in, it's really helpful, right? So the rat learned that to get away from this bad thing, I can hit this button, I can hit this lever, and it works. So we see an increase in button hitting behavior, right? Now, what does this look like in dog training? I want to be totally honest, this is one where there is a lot of discussion. And every time I go into a learning environment as a trainer, this particular quadrant will come up time and time and time again. And I can guarantee you that everybody in the room will be arguing about it. It is just one of those things where we all butt heads. I can give you some examples and I can also explain to you why we butt heads. And I'm not going to answer the question for you because I think the truth is the question is reasonably unanswerable. It comes down to your own decision in the end, I guess. So it's up for a debate. Anyway, an example here, a head collar or a slip lead. And I'm going to use the word head collar because I think it's quite interesting that we think of head collars as being all right and being nice. Generally, a lot of positive reinforcement trainers will use a head collar, and I believe they are not a positive piece of equipment. I believe they're not a force-free piece of equipment because you put a head collar on the dog, and when they're pulling, they experience discomfort. The only way a head collar works is because the dog doesn't care for the experience of it being on its nose. And what happens is as they pull, it pulls their nose down and they think, I don't really like this. This isn't very nice. Okay. So conceptually, they've got this experience. It's not very nice. When they offer the behavior of walking next to you, the pressure on that head collar reduces and they feel more comfortable. So they've removed the negative experience of the head collar and increased their behavior of walking next to the human. Okay. Therefore, if we used it in that specific way, when the pressure's on to remove it, increase the behavior, that would be classed as negative reinforcement. However, and here's the ethical debate, technically speaking, and you know me, I'm a stickler. Technically speaking, at the point of applying the head collar, the dog was not pulling because you cannot physically apply a head collar to a dog that is in front of you pulling on a lead. You cannot get to it. It is in front of you pulling on lead. It is literally mutually exclusive behavior. Therefore, at the point of putting on the head collar on the dog, it was not pulling. Therefore, it did not experience the pulling of the head collar until it actually performed the behavior of pulling on the lead. So therefore, Surely it's dog pulls on lead, dog experiences discomfort. That's positive punishment. That's adding a punishment. You just had the foresight to add it 5 minutes ago when the dog was stood around before you went for your walk. You've understood the concept of delayed punishment. The dog hasn't, you have. So to me, technically, that would be positive punishment. People don't like to hear that, though, particularly force-free trainers. They do not like to hear that they've used punishment in their training and added a punishment in. However, if you put a piece of equipment on a dog that you know works by causing it discomfort, that's essentially what you've done. So it is really worth noting, though, that whichever quadrant this falls into with your own set of ethics and your own set of standards and your own set of working, I don't really care, to be fair with you. You can have your own, that's fine. I've got mine. It's worth noting, though, that whichever one it falls into, the loose lead effect will only work when that piece of equipment is applied to the dog, because they're not learning to walk next to the human. They're not learning to loose lead walk. They're not learning an active skill of walking next to the human. What they are learning is to avoid discomfort, whether that be to have it in the first place or to get away from it when it is happening. The only reason head collars and slip leads work is because the dog learns to avoid discomfort. They don't actively learn the action of walking next to us. So for me, I'm not okay with putting a piece of equipment on that's going to cause discomfort. It just doesn't sit right with me. And also, since positive reinforcement really is the way to teach the dog to learn the new skill of, I like to walk next to you, and that skill then is transferable between equipment. So I could put on a harness, I could put them on a collar, I could let go of them, I could have nothing on them. They've learned the skill of walking next to me. My choice is to teach that behavior using positive reinforcement, not any of positive punishment or negative reinforcement. That would be my choice. Okay. And certainly at focused dog training, we don't use equipment like that. So cleaner examples, though, of negative reinforcement can be found. They're just ones that happen a little bit more naturally than the human intervention side of it, I guess. So, for example, dogs who are overwhelmed by people in your house, what they'll often do is they'll go to their crate. And once they're in their crate, they realise that removes the drama of the people in front of them, that gets them away from that horrible scenario that they weren't particularly enjoying. So what we see is an increase in behaviour of dogs going to crates when people and guests come around to your home. Actually quite a helpful thing, actually. If your dog is uncomfortable and it learns that it can take itself away to a safe place, super duper. A really quirky example is dogs who lunge and bark at other dogs on the street. So for this dog, for the dog that's lunging and barking, if it's nervous and worried by the dogs on the side, not necessarily if it's excited, but certainly if it's nervous and worried by the other dog, your dog's experience is, there's another dog in my zone, in my space. I'm not okay with that. I find this aversive. I find this nasty. I don't like this. So I'm going to bark and lunge. And this dog then leaves. Side note, your dog isn't clever enough to know that they were on their own walk anyway, and they were going to go ahead and they were going to go because they were on the other side of the road and that's what they were doing. Your dog isn't knowing that. Your dog knows it's in my space. I bark, I lunge, they leave my space. That worked for them. It got rid of the negative experience. So that barking, lunging behavior is likely to increase then after that, because they go, I liked that, it worked for me, it got rid of the negative thing. We're going to see an increase in that behavior. Okay. Last quadrant, it's 1:15. I knew this was going to go over. The last quadrant then is to negative punishment, and that's written as P minus negative punishment. And this one means that the learner has something good removed in order to see a decrease in that behavior. Okay, so in Skinner's experiment, this meant that instead of releasing food when the lever was pressed, he taught the rats to press the lever and get the food, positive reinforcement, happy days. And then what he did was he changed the rules again. And when they pressed the lever, no food came. He took the good stuff away. They knew they were going to get the good stuff, and now they're not getting the good stuff. So guess what happened? The rats went, oh, fuck you. They stopped pressing the lever. It saw a reduction in behaviour because actually the good stuff had been removed from them. You're not going to keep doing something if there's nothing in it for you. There's a really big discussion in there about relationships that we get ourselves into and yada, yada, yada. Of course there is, but there you go. We talk about banging our head against a brick wall when we're talking to us kids. Perhaps you need to look at the variables and the things you have control over there. So an easy example here in training, it is really lovely, it's a very easy one, is dogs jumping on us. Generally, dogs are jumping on us because they want access to us, they want to say hi to us, they want to be touched by us, they want to be looked at by us, they want to be spoken to, they want interaction with us, right? Dogs jumping on me, I've deemed that a behaviour that I don't really like. I want to see a decrease in that behaviour. So I remove myself from that. I either physically take myself out the room, or I just take away the stuff that I know they want access to, my hands, my face, the talking. I'm going to remove that away from them. Okay. Consequently, the dog hopefully would learn, oh, when I jump, the good stuff goes away, therefore I'm going to stop jumping. Okay. Now, in the real world, this quadrant is a little bit like positive punishment in that it kind of just says no. It doesn't actually guide them to what we want them to do. It kind of just says, no, don't do that. It doesn't say, but do this instead. So this is most effective when we pair it with positive reinforcement. So in this scenario, what I would say is I would like my dog to stop jumping up at me, and I would like them to keep 4 paws on the floor. The thing that they would really like as a consequence of their behavior is me. So when they're jumping up at me, I want to see a decrease in that behavior. I'm going to remove myself. But when they do the thing that I want them to do, I'm going to give myself as the reward. So the thing that I want them to do, the thing I want to see more of, is 4 paws on the floor. Don't really care about sitting, that's really hard, but 4 paws on the floor. And then I'm going to go, good, clever. And I'm going to bring myself down to them, because I'll reduce the jumping, bring myself down and give them the love. Hi, clever boy, clever girl, well done. Yeah, because I'm going to add myself in as a reward, right? And it's a really nice way to use 2 quadrants together. And what you're doing is you're saying, not that, but this. Really helpful for our learners if we're really helpful in guiding them and showing them what we want them to do. So they're your 4 quadrants. I hope they didn't get too muddling in there for you. There is some discussion around stuff, but hey. The very last thing I want to just touch on then before we kind of wrap up and go to questions. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the question box. I notice Claire's already asked something. Thank you very much. We'll get to that in a second. The last thing I want to touch on then is what is a punishment and what is a reward. And we will do a longer video on this. But in essence, it's whatever your dog thinks is a punishment or a reward. And that's different for every single dog, right? So in most circumstances, most dogs find food pretty rewarding. Okay. So adding it in as a consequence is usually a good plan. However, if your dog doesn't like the food that you have, I don't know, maybe they really just dislike fish, or they don't want the chicken, or I don't know, whatever. They don't find that food that you have in your hands rewarding, then it's not a reinforcer. It doesn't work. Also, if maybe, I don't know, maybe they've got a dodgy tummy that day. We all have days like this, or we have a dodgy tummy and we just don't really want to eat. Or maybe they've just eaten their lunch and they're not actually hungry. That piece of food in your hand isn't really that much of a reward at this point. If I've got my dad used to call a triple T, a tummy touching table moment, adding more food is not rewarding to me right now. We're all about to experience this at Christmas, and that somebody says, do you want a mince pie? Oh, no, it's not a reward at that point. But in most circumstances, it is a reward. So we need to watch our dogs there, okay? Equally, stuff that you might not often think about as punishing. Obviously, I've used very clear-cut examples for punishments, like lead tuck, very clear example, right? It's not a pleasant experience, right? But stuff that we don't necessarily notice or even think about can be really punishing to our dogs. So some dogs get really turned off when we start taking ourselves away from them. We mean it to be a removal of good things to see a reduction. But actually sometimes they go, oh God, that's awful. I hated that. I really hated it. It wasn't just tolerable. It wasn't just a moment for me to stop and think. I really hated that. And we have to be careful. Or little things like Lauren's dog, Luna, does not like sitting on one long wet grass. I mean, really, who can blame her? I wouldn't want to put my bare bottom on long wet grass either. And I think that's very reasonable of her. But to such a point that if Lauren asks her to sit when it's cold and wet, she doesn't want to. She sees a reduction. Lauren sees a reduction in Luna's behaviour when it's on cold, wet, soggy grass. It's a punishment. It's absolutely a punishment, right? So you'll only really know if something is a reward or a punishment, a reinforcer or a punishment to your dog by watching them over a period of repetitions, over a period of time. If you see the behavior that you're asking for increase, the consequence that's happening to the dog is good and they're seeing it as a reinforcement, whatever it is. If you're doing this behavior over a period of time, you're seeing a reduction in it, the consequence that's been provided to them after that behavior has been performed is classed as a punishment according to the dog. It could be that you're feeding it carrot and it is stopping doing that behavior because it doesn't like carrot. You could be like the Chihuahua that we've just been training that bloody loved carrot, best thing in the entire planet, and you see a real increase. Every single dog is different. So what you need to do is watch your dog when you're doing your training and ask the question, is this behavior increasing or decreasing? Is it likely that the consequence that's been provided at the end of the behavior, is it a reward or is it a punishment? Use the data that you get and change yourself, adjust your training accordingly to counteract that. Perfect. Okie dokie. That's me done. 22 minutes past. I've not done that badly. Lauren, I know we've got a question from Claire. Do we have any other questions for me to be answering this evening? I'm going to hand over to you now.
I've got some for you. Do you want to jump into Claire's question first?
We can do, yeah. I can't read it based on the screen that I've got, so you'll have to read it to me.
I'll read it to you. So Claire said, why do you say that slip leads only work when the dog is wearing them, so not transferable, but learning by rewarding good behaviour, giving treats, is transferable even when you don't have the treats? Isn't it part of learning, just practicing the desirable behaviour, and both ways give the practice?
Yes. So we will do another discussion on rates of reinforcement, because that's a really big part of operant conditioning as well. So rates of reinforcement simply mean how often I give my treat to my dog. And what we know about behavior, both humans, it's very, very widely studied in humans, but also transfers across to dogs, is gambling. If a animal thinks that the behavior performed is going to get a good consequence, they're likely to gamble that, and they're likely to offer that with a chance of getting a good thing. People and other animals are less likely to gamble if there's a negative at the end of it, unless they have an understanding of odds. Humans are particularly interesting for that. But if your dog thinks, I have repeatedly done this behavior, and my learning history, my past experiences of repeating this behavior mean that I know I am very likely to get a good consequence from it, what they often do is chuck that behavior, and I'll give it a punt, I'll give it a good go. And they'll throw that behavior at you thinking, there's a good chance I'm going to get a treat here, or a good chance I'm going to get a decent consequence out of this. And if they don't get a good consequence, the chances are that they will continue to do that behavior for us for a period of time. What you'll find is it will decline. If we stop giving rewards altogether, that would be a negative punishment, wouldn't it? Be removing the good stuff, right? So what we would see is a reduction then in that behavior. So we do see a reduction if we stop offering that, because then it turns into a positive punishment. But because they're quite happy to offer behavior if there's a chance that it's going to go right, they do keep offering it. Positive, removing negative stuff, removing slip leads, whether it sits in the positive punishment or it sits in the negative reinforcement, it only works when the tool is on, because what we know from removal of punishments is that when the punishing thing is not around and not in existence, the behavior resurfaces. I can give you a really good human example of this: speed cameras. So speed cameras work effectively when we know that they are there. We will slow ourselves down because we don't want to get caught. On roads where speed cameras are not there, it's very likely that we start speeding again, because the consequence has been removed and we don't necessarily act that way naturally. The behavior hasn't been brought about. We haven't chosen to actively engage with that unless there's been that threat hanging over our head. And the same would be true of animals as well. So the slip lead, unfortunately, usually only works. I say usually because there will always be a dog. Somebody will come to me and be like, well, my dog didn't. Of course, there's always a curveball, kid. But in the vast majority of cases, once you take the punishing factor away, then you tend to see that behavior resurfaces. You'll see this across handlers as well. So one handler will handle their dog and they might be quite stern and strict with the way that they expect it to behave, and they come to a different handler and we have different expectations, and that behavior might start resurfacing itself again. Who knows? There's all sorts of things in there. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole if I keep talking, Lauren, so I'm going to come back to you and let you give me another question there to make me shut up.
We have a question from Rachel. This is an interesting one. You're going to like this. So okay. She said, regarding the barking and lunging making the bad thing go away, should we then stop, let them bark and lunge, and then only keep walking when the dog stops barking or lunging, so they learn that the barking doesn't make the bad thing go away?
Okay, so for this, for that to work, what you'd need is a controlled setup. You would need the other person to stop. So, but the reality here is you're out on a street walk, you've got your dog and you're walking along your street. Here's the other dog walking towards you. At some point, this dog gets close enough to your dog for your dog to go, don't like this anymore. This is aversive to me. This is horrible. I'm going to start my barking order. For your suggestion to work, this person would need to stand perfectly still right now. Your dog would had head up, keep barking and lunging, and then it'd stop and you'd go, yeah, well done. Now it'll go. Okay. The reality is, though, that isn't life. You can't stop this person and then get them to go away and magically disappear when your dog stops. I can see what you're sort of saying. Some trainers genuinely train like this. My argument would be, the reason that your dog is barking and lunging, it's because they're uncomfortable with this person. We're on to an ethics debate now, because it's not very nice to let your dog be uncomfortable for that long until they're stopping doing that behavior and then that's going away again. So it's not very nice for the dog to experience that. So any trainer that's doing that, I'm thinking, oh, you're not a very nice person, because you're actively making that dog worried, right? That's not a great place to be. But also what we know from experience, and this taps into something that I appreciate we haven't touched on before, but would be something called flooding, where essentially we're exposing the dog to something that we know is not very nice and they're not going to enjoy it. They perform the behavior, but actually what happens is they just learn that shouting and barking doesn't work, and it doesn't change their association with the dog. What they're not learning is that dog coming in is okay. What they're learning is that dog coming in, there's nothing I can do about it, so I might as well just stand here. And what you get is dogs that literally go, and they just close in on, so we call them shut down, and they just close in on themselves. They stop offering behavior, and it's really sad, because actually they're not learning that that's okay. They're just learning that there's nothing that they can do about it, and that's a really uncomfortable experience. So much better instead to work on that distance and start saying, you see that dog all the way over there, let's associate it. This goes back to the classical conditioning from last week. Let's associate it with something good. Quadrants here would be used, because we would say, we'll give you an alternative behavior. When you see a dog, and this is what we teach them, we say, when you see a dog, turn and look at mummy and good stuff happens to you. So we do positive reinforcement. We say, when you look at your mummy, as after seeing the dog, you look at your mummy, good stuff happens to you. That would be a positive reinforcement that goes in. So the dog starts learning, first of all, I'm at distance and I'm feeling better because of that classical conditioning that we've got going on, counter conditioning. And second of all, when I perform an alternative behavior, I get good stuff happening. And then we start just working closer and closer and closer as we will go. So that would be the approach that we would take in terms of training that behavior and supporting that dog there. Any more, Lauren?
Rachel said, thank you very much. That was really helpful. Claire apologised that she had to shoot off.
To be fair, it is past. I think unless there's anything massive left over, I feel like it would be a good point to wrap up.
Yeah. Let's check.
Nothing else big left over to be answering for people now. Perfect. Okie dokie. Right. So good questions there, team. Thank you very much. I liked it. Okay. So that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Next week, like I said, we're going to be looking at criteria in training, what to reward, when to reward it. We're going to look at breaking down those really difficult behaviors. What if I am literally not seeing the behavior that I want to reward? And I'm really, really looking forward to that. Thank you again for joining me this evening. Have a fantastic evening. Goodbye.